He stood there, 19 years old, holding 2 American coins in his trembling hand, staring at 2 impossible choices, ice cream or Coca-Cola. And in that moment, Klaus Weber realized that everything he had been told about the enemy was a lie. The dime felt heavy in his palm, heavier than it should. The nickel beside it, lighter. Together they represented a choice that shouldn't exist. Not here. Not for him. Not for a German prisoner of war standing in an enemy camp, 6,000 miles from a homeland that was burning. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe. This is a true account from history that deserves to be remembered. But to understand why this moment shattered Klaus Weber, why it broke something inside him that would never fully heal, we need to go back. Back to 6 months earlier, when Klaus was still a believer. When the world still made sense. When he knew who the enemy was and what they deserved. February 1944, a small village outside Stuttgart, Germany. Klaus Weber celebrated his 18th birthday in a cellar while Allied bombers flew overhead. The windows rattled, dust fell from the ceiling beams. His mother held his hand in the darkness, her grip tight enough to hurt. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was normal now. This was life. 3 weeks later, the conscription notice arrived. Klaus reported to the induction center on a frozen morning in March. His mother walked him to the train station. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. She simply held his face in her rough hands, looked into his eyes, and said 5 words. Make your father proud. Klaus. His father had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. Klaus had been 16 when the telegram came. He remembered his mother reading it, her face going white, her hand reaching for the kitchen table to steady herself. She had folded the telegram carefully, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke his father's name again. Now it was Klaus's turn. He wore his father's watch. It was the only thing the army had sent back. The leather strap was cracked and stained with something Klaus tried not to think about. But it still worked. It still kept time. And that felt important somehow. Basic training was brutal, but brief. Germany was running out of time and running out of men. They taught Klaus how to shoot, how to dig a foxhole, how to follow orders without thinking. The instructors were old men and wounded veterans. Their faces hard and their words harder. They told the recruits what to expect. The enemy was everywhere. The Allies were mongrels, weak and undisciplined. The Soviets were animals, subhuman and cruel. Germany was fighting for its survival against the entire world. Klaus believed them. Why wouldn't he? This was all he had ever known. He had grown up in the Hitler Youth, marching and singing and learning that Germany was great and its enemies were evil. The propaganda films showed clear lines between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. Klaus had watched them in school, in theaters, in town squares. He had cheered when German soldiers marched across the screen. He had hissed when Allied forces appeared. The doubt never came. How could it? Doubt was weakness. Doubt was treason. Doubt could get you killed. If not by the enemy, then by your own officers. So Klaus buried any questions deep and focused on survival. One lecture stuck with him. An officer, older, scarred across half his face, spoke to the recruits the night before deployment. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he had given this speech 1,000 times. If you were captured, he said, pausing to let the word hang in the air, remember that you represent the Reich. The enemy will try to break you. The Americans will mock you, humiliate you, possibly torture you. The Soviets will work you to death in their camps. If you have a choice between capture and death, choose death. Die with honor. Die as a German soldier. The recruits sat in silence. Klaus felt his stomach tighten. He touched his father's watch, feeling the cracked leather beneath his fingers. He would not be captured. He would fight. And if necessary, he would die. Just like his father. They shipped Klaus to France in April 1944. The train rattled west through Germany, through the Rhineland, across the border. Klaus pressed his face against the window, watching his country slide past. Cities stood hollow and broken, their buildings reduced to shells. Factories operated behind blackout curtains. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and gray and exhausted. This was the fatherland he was defending. This was what remained. France was worse. The French countryside should have been beautiful in spring, green and lush and alive. Instead it was scarred with craters and trenches, littered with the wreckage of vehicles and the graves of soldiers. Klaus's unit was assigned to a defensive position near the coast. Their orders were simple: hold the line. Stop the invasion everyone knew was coming. The Americans and British landed on June 6, 1944. Klaus was 15 miles inland, but he heard the bombardment. The naval guns sounded like thunder that never stopped. The ground shook. The sky filled with smoke. Officers shouted orders that made no sense. Klaus and his unit dug in and waited. The war came to them slowly, like a tide. First the planes, roaring overhead in formation so vast they blocked the sun. Then the artillery, pounding their positions day and night. Then the tanks rolling forward with infantry behind them. Klaus's unit retreated. Then retreated again. Then again. They left their dead where they fell. There was no time for burial, no time for anything except moving backward, always backward. Klaus learned what war really meant. Not the glory from the films, not the honor from the speeches. War meant sleeping in mud. War meant eating rotted food and drinking water that tasted like chemicals. War meant watching your friend Ernst get cut in half by a strafing run, his body torn apart so fast he didn't even scream. War meant covering yourself in Ernst's blood, knowing that tomorrow it might be your blood on someone else's uniform. The hunger was worst. Supplies stopped coming. The officer said it was temporary, just a disruption in the supply lines. But the disruption lasted days, then weeks. Klaus's unit ate grass and tree bark. They boiled leather belts to make soup. One soldier ate a raw frog he caught in a stream and vomited for hours afterward. Klaus's stomach cramped constantly, a hollow ache that never left. By August, Klaus weighed maybe 130 pounds. He had been 165 when he enlisted. His uniform hung loose on his frame. His hands shook. His gums bled when he tried to chew the hard ration bread they occasionally received. He looked at his reflection in a puddle one morning and didn't recognize the face staring back. Hollow-cheeked, dark-eyed, skull-like. He looked like the pictures of Soviet prisoners the propaganda ministry published. On August 15th, near the town of St. Lo, Klaus's unit was surrounded. They had been falling back through a forest when American armor cut off their retreat. 23 men remained from the original company of 150. They had no ammunition left, no food, no orders. Their officer was dead, killed by artillery 3 days earlier. The ranking soldier, a corporal named Dietrich, gathered them in a clearing. "We surrender," he said. Some men protested. Surrender was cowardice. Surrender was betrayal. But Dietrich was unmoved. "We're out of bullets," he said flatly. "We can die for nothing or we can live. I choose to live." He took off his white undershirt and tied it to a stick. Then he walked toward the American lines, the makeshift flag raised above his head. Klaus dropped his rifle. His hands went up. His heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst. This was it. This was the moment he had been warned about. The Americans would line them up. They would laugh. They would shoot them like dogs. Klaus thought of his mother. He thought of Ernst. He thought of his father's watch on his wrist, still keeping time, still marking the seconds until his death. The Americans came through the trees. The sound reached them first. Engines, diesel, and gasoline. Rumbling like mechanical beasts. Then voices shouting in English. Then the soldiers themselves, appearing between the trees with rifles raised. They wore clean uniforms. They looked fed. They looked strong. Klaus and his unit looked like scarecrows. An American sergeant approached, his rifle pointed at the ground but ready. He looked at the ragged line of German soldiers, at their hollow faces and skeletal frames. He said something in English. None of the Germans understood. The sergeant tried again, slower, louder. Still nothing. He gestured, "Hands up, move forward." They obeyed. Klaus waited for the bullet. It didn't come. Instead, an American medic appeared, a red cross on his helmet. He knelt beside Otto, one of Klaus's unit, who had shrapnel in his leg from yesterday's shelling. The medic examined the wound. His hands quick and efficient. He called something over his shoulder. Another medic came with a bag. They cleaned the wound right there, in the forest, while Klaus watched in confusion. Why were they treating him? He was the enemy. This had to be some kind of trick. They would heal him, then interrogate him, then kill him. But they didn't. The Americans searched the Germans for weapons, found none, and began marching them back through the forest. Klaus walked on numb legs, his mind trying to process what was happening. They passed American supply trucks. Soldiers sat eating from tin cans, smoking cigarettes, talking and laughing. They glanced at the German prisoners with mild curiosity, nothing more. No hatred, no anger, just indifference. They reached a road where more American vehicles waited. An officer stood beside a jeep, whilst checking a clipboard. He looked at the German prisoners, counted them, made a note. Then he said something to the sergeant. The sergeant nodded and gestured to a truck. The Germans climbed into the back. As they did, another American soldier handed up canteens. Water. Klaus took one, his hands shaking. He sniffed it, expecting it to be contaminated or poisoned. It smelled like water. He took a small sip, ready to spit it out. It was water. Just water. Clean and cool. An older prisoner, a man named Hans who had fought in Poland in 1939, drank deeply and then whispered, "They're fattening us up for something worse. Don't trust this." Klaus wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to believe him, but his throat was so dry and the water was so clean that he drank anyway. They drove for an hour. The truck passed through a liberated French village. People lined the streets, watching the German prisoners pass. Their faces showed what Klaus had expected to see on the Americans: hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred. An old woman spat toward the truck. A man shouted something in French, his voice full of venom. A young woman threw a rock that clanged off the truck's side. The American guards immediately moved to the truck's edges, standing between the prisoners and the civilians. One guard, young and nervous-looking, raised his hand to the crowd. "Back," he shouted. "Get back." The Americans were protecting them from their own allies. Klaus's mind struggled to understand. The French wanted revenge, which made sense. The Wehrmacht had occupied France for 4 years. But the Americans were shielding their prisoners from that revenge. Why? They kept Klaus and his unit at a temporary holding facility for 3 days. Barbed wire enclosures, armed guards, the trappings of captivity, but also food. Twice a day, guards brought in large metal pots of soup and stacks of bread. The soup was thin, mostly water and vegetables, but it was hot. The bread was coarse but real. Klaus ate slowly, his shrunken stomach cramping after just a few bites. Around him, other prisoners ate until they vomited, then ate more. On the 3rd day, they were loaded onto trucks again and driven to the coast. Klaus saw the ocean for the first time in his life. It stretched vast and gray under cloudy skies. Ships crowded the harbor, hundreds of them, military vessels painted in camouflage patterns. The scale of it overwhelmed him. Germany had nothing like this. Germany had lost the ability to produce anything like this. How had they ever thought they could win? The Americans herded them onto a Liberty ship, a converted cargo vessel that smelled of oil and salt. 800 German prisoners were packed into the hold, assigned to hammocks strung in rows. The space was cramped, dim, poorly ventilated, but compared to the foxholes and trenches Klaus had lived in for months, it was almost comfortable. He had a hammock. He could lie down fully. That alone felt like luxury. The ship sailed on August 20th, 1944. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days. Klaus spent most of it sick. The ship rolled constantly, rising and falling with the swells. His stomach, still adjusting to regular food, rebelled. He vomited into buckets that other prisoners emptied over the side. Half the Germans in the hold were similarly afflicted, the air thick with the smell of sickness. But even in this misery, there was food. Twice a day, American sailors brought down metal trays of meals. Oatmeal in the morning, thick and sweet with sugar. Klaus hadn't tasted in years. Beans and bread in the evening, sometimes with canned meat. Klaus forced himself to eat despite the nausea. His body needed it. He could feel himself getting stronger, his hands steadying, his mind clearing. The prisoners talked in the darkness of the hold. Arguments broke out constantly. Some men, like Otto, remained defiant. "This is temporary," Otto insisted. "When we reach America, the real treatment begins. They're saving us for labor camps. We'll work in their factories until we die." Others were more cynical. Dieter, a veteran of the North Africa campaign who had been captured and repatriated in a prisoner exchange before being sent to France, spoke with bitter experience. "The Americans don't want us dead," he said. "Dead prisoners are worthless. They'll work us, yes, but they'll feed us enough to keep us working. It's efficient." Klaus listened but said little. He was still processing what had happened. The Americans had captured him, fed him, given him water and medical care. They hadn't beaten him. They hadn't tortured him. They had simply treated him like a prisoner, like a human being who happened to be on the wrong side. On the 5th day at sea, a storm hit. The ship pitched violently, rising on massive swells and crashing down into troughs. Water seeped through the hull plates. The hold flooded inches deep with seawater mixed with vomit. Men clung to their hammocks, terrified the ship would capsize. Klaus held onto the ropes, his knuckles white, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The Americans evacuated the lowest section of the hold, the one taking on the most water. They moved those prisoners up to a higher deck, cramming them into already crowded spaces. No one was left below to drown. Guards distributed buckets for bailing and vomiting. One medic came down with pills for seasickness, distributing them to the worst cases. Klaus got one. He swallowed it and within an hour felt marginally better. The storm passed after 2 days. The ship limped on, and on August 28th, land appeared on the horizon. America. Klaus pressed against the hull porthole with dozens of other prisoners, straining to see. The ship entered New York Harbor at dawn, and there, rising from the water like something from a dream, was the Statue of Liberty. Klaus had seen pictures of it in school. The propaganda version, symbol of the mongrel nation, a false goddess of false freedom. But seeing it in person was different. It was massive, copper green, her torch raised against the morning sky. Klaus stared at it, unable to look away. Whatever else America was, whatever evils the propaganda had told him about, they had built this. And it was beautiful. The New York skyline appeared behind the statue, buildings taller than Klaus had imagined possible, stretching up and up, their windows catching the rising sun. The city was whole, undamaged. No bomb craters, no burned-out shells, just buildings, standing clean and tall and completely untouched by war. Klaus felt something crack inside him. Germany was rubble. His city was ruins. His mother was living in a cellar, and America looked like this. Pristine, untouched, impossibly wealthy. They didn't dock in New York. The ship continued up the coast and then inland through what the guard said was the Panama Canal, though Klaus couldn't see much from the hold. They sailed for another week, stopping briefly at several ports. Finally, in mid-September, they arrived at Seattle, Washington. From there, the prisoners were loaded onto trains. Not cattle cars, passenger cars. Old worn coaches with threadbare seats, but passenger cars nonetheless. Klaus sat next to a window, his face pressed against the glass as America rolled past. The country was vast. They traveled for days, and the landscape never seemed to end. Forests gave way to farmland, farmland to plains, plains to mountains, mountains to more forests. And everywhere, everything was intact. Farms with full barns, towns with lit streetlights, cars driving on paved roads, people going about their lives as if there was no war at all. Franz, the youngest of Klaus's group at 17, pointed at everything with childlike wonder. "Look, a real automobile, just driving around." Otto scowled. "While our people starve, they drive around in automobiles." Dieter said nothing, just stared out the window with unreadable eyes. The train stopped every 12 hours at military installations. The prisoners were fed at station canteens. Hot meals, stew, bread, coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute Klaus had drunk in Germany. The coffee was bitter and strong and wonderful. At one stop, they were given donuts, fried dough dusted with sugar. Franz bit into one and his eyes went wide. "What is this?" he asked, his mouth full. Klaus tried one. The sweetness exploded on his tongue. He hadn't tasted sugar like this in 2 years. He ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and tried not to think about his mother eating watery turnip soup. At one station, local children gathered to watch the train. They stood behind a fence, staring at the German prisoners with curiosity and fear. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, waved tentatively. Franz, without thinking, waved back. The girl's mother immediately pulled her away, not violently but protectively. She looked at Franz with fear, not hatred. She was afraid of them, yes, but she didn't want them hurt. She just wanted her daughter safe. Klaus understood that look. His own mother had given him that same look when he was young and strangers approached. These people weren't monsters. They were just people. The train arrived at Fort Lewis on September 10th, 1944. The camp was enormous, sprawling across cleared forest with mountains visible in the distance. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines. Guard towers stood at intervals, but they weren't the menacing structures Klaus had expected. They looked almost perfunctory, as if the guards didn't really expect trouble. Barbed wire marked the perimeter, but it seemed more like a boundary than a barrier. They were processed immediately. Names recorded, ranks documented, personal effects cataloged. Klaus's Iron Cross was placed in an envelope with his name written on it. "You'll get this back when you're released," the clerk said in broken German. Released. Not if. When. They were assuming release. They were assuming the prisoners would go home someday. Next came medical examination. A doctor, older with kind eyes, checked Klaus thoroughly. He measured Klaus's height and weight. 5'9", 132 pounds, he noted in English. He examined Klaus's feet, where trench foot had begun to develop in France. The skin was cracked and infected. The doctor cleaned the wounds, applied sulfa powder, and wrapped them in clean bandages. "Stay off your feet for 3 days," he told Klaus through a translator. "Light duty only." Light duty. Klaus was a prisoner. There was duty at all? They were taken to showers. Klaus tensed. Showers. The word carried weight. Everyone had heard the rumors about camps in the East, about showers that weren't showers, but the translator, seeing their faces, spoke quickly. "This is only for delousing. Hot water and soap. You will be given clean clothes, that is all. I promise you, that is all." Klaus wanted to believe him, but couldn't. Trust was impossible. They stripped, leaving their filthy uniforms in piles. The showers came on, and Klaus flinched, expecting gas. But it was water. Hot water cascading from overhead pipes. Real water that steamed in the cool air. Klaus stood under the spray, feeling months of grime wash away. His skin, his hair, his very soul felt cleaner. Around him, other prisoners wept. Some laughed, strange broken sounds. Klaus just stood there, eyes closed, letting the water run over him, trying to understand. They were given clean clothes, denim work uniforms, stamped PW on the back. Prisoner of war. The clothes were worn but clean and intact. Klaus dressed slowly, his hands clumsy. He looked down at himself and barely recognized his own body. Finally, they were taken to the barracks. Building number 7. Long wooden structure with rows of bunk beds. 50 men per barracks. Each bunk had a thin mattress, sheets, and a wool blanket. Klaus was assigned an upper bunk. He climbed up and sat on the mattress, testing it. It was thin, barely padded, but it was a mattress. He lay back and stared at the wooden ceiling. Around him, other prisoners settled in, their voices low and confused. An older prisoner approached. Hans, mid-40s, captured in North Africa over a year ago. He had the weathered look of someone who had learned the system. "Listen, kid," he said to Klaus, "forget everything you think you know. The Americans aren't what we were told. You work 6 days, rest Sunday. You get paid 80 cents a day in camp scrip, 3 meals a day. You can buy things at the canteen. There's a library, movies on Saturday nights. You follow the rules, they leave you alone. Try to escape, they'll shoot you. But if you just do your work, you'll be fine." Klaus stared at him. "Movies? Libraries? Paid?" "I don't understand," he said. Hans shrugged. "Neither did I at first. But you will. Come on, it's dinner time." The mess hall was overwhelming. Long tables, benches, prisoners moving through a cafeteria line, American soldiers serving food onto metal trays. Klaus took a tray and moved forward numbly. Mashed potatoes scooped onto his plate. Meat. He wasn't sure what kind. Gravy poured over everything. Green beans, bread, a cup of coffee. He found a seat and stared at the food. It was more than he had seen on one plate in months, maybe a year. Otto sat across from him, his face twisted with anger. "This is obscene," he said. "Our brothers are starving in Germany and we're eating like kings." Dieter, next to him, replied flatly, "Then don't eat." Otto stared at his plate for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and ate. They all ate. Because they were hungry. Because the food was there. Because they were alive and their bodies demanded fuel. Klaus ate slowly, his stomach cramping. The potatoes were real, smooth and creamy. The meat was beef, he thought, rich and salty. The bread was soft, not the rock-hard ration bread he remembered. His stomach hurt after eating, shrunken from months of starvation. But he ate everything, every single bite. And when he was done, he felt something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Full. That night, Klaus lay in his bunk, clean and fed and warm. The barracks were heated, not much, but heated. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin and stared at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear guards on patrol, their boots crunching on gravel, but inside it was quiet. Safe. He was a prisoner of war. He was supposed to be suffering. He wasn't, and somehow that was the most disturbing thing of all. Klaus closed his eyes and waited for tomorrow, for the nightmare to finally begin. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he was starting to suspect that it wouldn't. That this was real. That the enemy had shown him more mercy than his own country ever had. And that realization was more terrifying than any torture could have been. Morning came with the sound of a bell. 6 o'clock. Klaus woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where he was. Then memory returned. Fort Lewis, Washington, America, prison camp. He climbed down from his bunk, his bandaged feet tender but healing. The barracks stirred around him, 50 men rising from their beds, stretching, yawning, moving toward the latrines. They were given 15 minutes to wash and dress. Then the march to the mess hall. Breakfast was waiting. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, real coffee that steamed in white ceramic cups. Klaus sat at a long table with Otto and Franz, eating in silence. The eggs were hot and fluffy, seasoned with salt and pepper. The toast was buttered. Klaus spread jam on his second slice, strawberry jam that tasted like summer. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten jam. Before the war? Maybe. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else. After breakfast, work assignments. An American officer stood at the front of the mess hall, reading names from a clipboard. Klaus Weber, forestry detail, report to the main gate. 20 other prisoners were called with him. They assembled outside where a truck waited. An American sergeant stood beside it, maybe 45 years old, weathered face, calm eyes. He looked them over without expression. "Anyone speak English?" he asked. Silence. He sighed. "All right, you'll figure it out. Load up." They drove into the forest surrounding Fort Lewis. The trees were enormous, pine and Douglas fir stretching hundreds of feet into the sky. The truck stopped at a clearing where equipment waited, axes, saws, chains. The sergeant gestured to a fallen tree. He pantomimed cutting, splitting, stacking. The prisoners understood. Labor. This was the labor they had been waiting for. They worked. Klaus picked up an axe, feeling its weight in his hands. The handle was smooth, well-worn. He swung at a log, the blade biting into the wood. Again. Again. The rhythm was familiar, almost meditative. Around him, other prisoners worked similarly, the forest filling with the sound of chopping and sawing. The sergeant watched, but did not push. When someone's technique looked dangerous, he would step in, demonstrate the proper method, then step back. After 2 hours, he called a break. 15 minutes. The prisoners sat on logs, breathing hard. An American private appeared with a water cooler and paper cups. He poured water for anyone who wanted it. Klaus drank, the cold water soothing his parched throat. At noon, they stopped for lunch. Box lunches, distributed from the truck. Klaus opened his, a sandwich, cheese and something that might have been ham, an apple, 2 cookies, a thermos bottle of water. He ate sitting on a fallen log, the forest quiet around him except for the sounds of men eating. Franz sat beside him, biting into his apple. The crunch was loud in the silence. "This is better than my job before the war," Franz said quietly. "I worked in a textile mill. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, terrible pay. This..." He gestured around them at the forest, the food, the relative peace. "This is easier." Otto, sitting nearby, turned on him. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. We are prisoners. This is captivity. Do not forget what they are." Franz looked down at his sandwich. "I'm just saying it's not what I expected." "That's the point," Otto said bitterly. "They want us to forget. They want us to be grateful. It's psychological warfare." Klaus said nothing. He finished his sandwich and lay back on the log, looking up through the canopy at patches of blue sky. Otto was right in a way. This was psychological warfare. But what Otto didn't understand, what Klaus was only beginning to realize, was that it was working. Not because the Americans were manipulating them, but because the contrast was too stark to ignore. In France, Klaus had been starving, sleeping in mud, watching his friends die. Here he was fed, housed, working in a forest that smelled like pine and earth. The difference wasn't subtle, it was absolute. They worked until 4 o'clock, then loaded back onto the truck. The ride back to camp was quiet, the prisoners exhausted but not broken. At the camp gate, and the sergeant addressed them in his limited German. "Good Arbeit," he said. "Good work." Then added, "Tomorrow. Same time." Klaus climbed down from the truck, his muscles aching but his stomach full. He had worked a full day of labor and he wasn't angry about it. That realization disturbed him more than the labor itself. That evening after dinner, Klaus discovered the canteen. It was a small building near the center of camp. Doors open, light spilling out into the dusk. Prisoners filed in and out, carrying purchases. Klaus joined the line, curious. Inside, the building looked like a store. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with goods. An American soldier sat behind a counter, looking bored. Klaus moved slowly along the shelves, reading labels. Cigarettes, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, 15 cents per pack. Candy bars, Hershey's chocolate, Baby Ruth, Milky Way, 5 cents each. Razor blades, shaving cream, soap, toothbrushes and toothpaste, writing paper, envelopes, pencils. And in the corner, 2 things that made Klaus stop and stare. A small freezer with a handwritten sign, ice cream cones, 10 cents, and beside it a red metal cooler with white script, Coca-Cola, 5 cents. Klaus stood there, his 2 weeks of saved wages in his pocket, $9.60 in camp script. He could afford anything in this store. He could afford everything in this store. But he couldn't move. His mind had frozen, caught between 2 impossible realities. Ice cream. Coca-Cola. These were luxuries he had heard about only in propaganda broadcasts, mocked as symbols of American decadence. While Europe burns, Americans eat ice cream. The propaganda minister's voice echoed in his memory. And now Klaus stood in a prison camp, a captured enemy soldier, staring at these same symbols of decadence, able to purchase them with money the enemy had paid him for his labor. He pulled out 2 coins, a dime and a nickel. They felt heavy in his palm, heavier than coins should feel. He stood there, paralyzed by choice, and something inside him began to crack. The clerk noticed him. "You okay, buddy?" he asked in English. Klaus didn't understand the words, but heard the concern in the tone. The clerk was concerned for him. An American soldier was showing concern for a German prisoner. Klaus's hand began to shake. The coins rattled in his palm. He looked at the ice cream freezer, then at the Coca-Cola cooler, then back at the coins. And suddenly, with crushing, absolute clarity, he understood something that shattered everything he had believed. He was lucky. Not lucky to be captured. Lucky to be captured by the Americans. If he had been sent east instead of west, if the Soviets had taken him instead of the Americans, he would be dead by now. Or dying in a Siberian labor camp, worked until his body gave out, frozen and starved and forgotten. But here, in this American camp, he was choosing between ice cream and Coca-Cola. Here he was being paid for his work. Here he was being fed 3 meals a day. Here he was healing instead of dying. Klaus pointed at the ice cream with a trembling finger. The clerk nodded, opened the freezer, scooped vanilla ice cream into a cone, handed it over. Klaus gave him the dime. The clerk dropped it into a cash box. Klaus took the cone, cold against his palm, already beginning to melt. He walked outside into the evening air. Other prisoners moved past him, some heading to the canteen, others returning to barracks. Klaus sat on a bench near the building and looked at the ice cream cone in his hand. White, smooth, beginning to drip down the sides. He licked it. The taste was cold and sweet and creamy, richer than anything he remembered. He licked again, catching the drips, not wasting a single drop, and then he began to cry. Silently, tears running down his face, sitting on a bench in an enemy prison camp, eating ice cream, Klaus Weber cried. Because he was grateful. Grateful to the enemy. Grateful to be a prisoner. Grateful to be here instead of there. And that gratitude felt like the deepest betrayal imaginable. He thought of his mother in Bremen, living in rubble, eating whatever scraps she could find. He thought of his father, frozen in the Russian snow at Stalingrad. He thought of Ernst, cut in half by American bullets in France. And here he sat, their son and comrade, eating ice cream purchased with American money, crying because he was grateful to be alive. The ice cream melted faster than he could eat it, running down his fingers. He licked them clean, not wasting anything. The sweetness filled his mouth, and the tears kept coming. When the cone was gone, he sat there, his hands sticky, his face wet, staring at nothing. A voice beside him. Hans, the older prisoner, sat down on the bench. He said nothing for a long moment, just sat there in the gathering darkness. Finally, he spoke. "The first time is the hardest," he said quietly. "The first time you realize you're grateful to be here. It feels like treason." Klaus wiped his face with his sleeve. "How do you live with it?" Hans was quiet. Then, "You accept that the world is more complicated than we were taught. You accept that the enemy can show mercy, and you try to become someone worthy of that mercy. It's all you can do." Klaus looked at his sticky hands. "My mother is starving, and I'm eating ice cream." "I know," Hans said. "My wife is dead, killed in a bombing raid on Hamburg last year. I found out 3 months ago in a letter from my sister. And I'm here alive and fed while my wife is buried in rubble. The guilt doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it." They sat in silence as darkness fell completely. Around them, the camp settled into evening routines. Lights came on in the barracks, guards changed shifts at the towers. Somewhere, a radio played American music, big band jazz that sounded nothing like the martial songs Klaus had grown up with. "They're showing a film tomorrow night," Hans said. "Something about the camps, the concentration camps. They're making us watch." He paused. "I've heard rumors about what's in them. If the rumors are true—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Klaus nodded slowly. "I heard rumors too, during training, but I thought they were propaganda, allied lies to make us look evil." "What if they're not lies?" Hans asked quietly. Klaus had no answer. They sat there as the night deepened, 2 German soldiers in an American prison camp, beginning to understand that everything they had fought for might have been monstrous, and that understanding was more painful than any physical torture could have been. The next evening, after work and dinner, the prisoners were assembled in the mess hall, chairs arranged in rows facing a white screen at the front. American officers stood along the walls, their faces serious. A projector sat at the back of the room, already loaded with film. The lights went out. The projector clicked on. And for the next hour, Klaus Weber watched hell. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, names he had never heard spoken aloud. Footage of liberation, taken by Allied cameramen. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. Living skeletons with eyes too large for their shrunken faces. Children impossibly thin, staring at the camera with dead expressions. The ovens, the gas chambers, the systematic industrial murder of millions. The mess hall was absolutely silent except for the projector's mechanical clicking. Some prisoners closed their eyes, unable to watch. Some covered their mouths. Klaus forced himself to look at every frame, every image, every horror. He owed them that much. The dead deserved to be seen. When the lights came back on, many prisoners were crying. Some sat stone-faced, rigid with denial. Otto was shaking, his hands clenched into fists. Franz looked like he might be sick. Dieter stared at the floor, his face gray. An American officer stood at the front. He spoke in English, then a translator repeated his words in German. "What you have just seen is real. These camps existed. They were built and operated by the Nazi regime. Millions died in them. This is what your leaders did. This is what Germany did. We show you this not to shame you, but because you need to see. Because the world needs to know. Because this must never happen again. The prisoners filed out in silence. No one spoke. What was there to say? Klaus walked back to the barracks in a daze, the images burned into his mind. He had served the Reich. He had believed in Germany's cause. He had fought for leaders who built factories of death. He had not known, but did that matter? He had been part of it. That night, lying in his bunk, Klaus could not sleep. Around him, other men wept quietly or lay awake in their own private hells. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed softly, over and over. Klaus stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how he was supposed to live with this knowledge. 2 days later, Otto tried to kill himself. Klaus found him in the latrine, his wrists cut with a piece of broken glass. Blood pooled on the concrete floor. Klaus shouted for help. American medics came running. They bandaged Otto's wrists, stopped the bleeding, carried him to the camp hospital. He survived. But his eyes, when Klaus visited him a week later, were empty. "I should have died in France," Otto said flatly. "I should have died a soldier. Now I have to live as this." He gestured to himself, to the bandages, to the hospital bed. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Klaus had no answer. He left Otto in the hospital and walked back to his barracks through the autumn rain, his hands in his pockets, his head down. The world had become too large and too complicated to understand. All the certainties of his youth had crumbled. The enemy was merciful. His own leaders were monsters. He was alive when he should be dead. And he was grateful for things he should despise. That evening, Klaus returned to the canteen. He bought a bottle of Coca-Cola with his nickel, opened it, and drank it slowly. It was sweet and fizzy and strange, tasting of caramel and something else he couldn't identify. He sat on the same bench as before, drinking his Coca-Cola, and realized that he was no longer the boy who had left Stuttgart. That boy had believed in clear lines between good and evil, between right and wrong. That boy was dead, killed somewhere between the ice cream cone and the concentration camp footage. What remained was someone new, someone who understood that mercy could come from enemies and evil could come from friends, and that living with that knowledge was the hardest thing he would ever do. Winter came to Fort Lewis. Snow fell on the barracks, turning the camp white and quiet. Christmas arrived. The Americans decorated the mess hall with evergreen branches and paper ornaments. On Christmas Eve, they served a feast: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pie. Klaus ate until his stomach ached, thinking of his mother eating nothing, and hated himself for every bite. After dinner, some prisoners sang German carols. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. The words caught in Klaus's throat. There was nothing holy about this. Nothing silent about the screaming in his mind. He sat in the back, unable to sing, unable to join the pretense that this was anything other than what it was. A comfortable captivity that felt like a betrayal of everything and everyone he had left behind. Spring came slowly to the Pacific Northwest. Snow melted, revealing muddy ground and early flowers. Klaus had been at Fort Lewis for 7 months. He had gained 30 pounds. His feet had healed completely. His hands, once soft from city life, were now calloused from forestry work. He looked healthy. He looked fed. He looked like someone who had been well cared for. And every time he caught his reflection in a window or a piece of metal, he felt sick. March brought news filtering into the camp. Germany was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were pushing from the east. Everyone knew the end was near. The prisoners gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, arguing about what it meant. Some clung to desperate hope. Secret weapons, miracle counterattacks, last-minute salvation. Others accepted the inevitable. Germany was finished. Klaus felt nothing. Numbness had become his constant companion. He worked his shifts in the forest, ate his meals, slept in his bunk, and moved through the days like a ghost. Franz tried to engage him in conversation, asking questions about what they would do after the war, but Klaus had no answers. The future was a blank space he couldn't imagine filling. On May 8, 1945, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. All prisoners were ordered to assemble in the main yard. They gathered in the spring sunshine, 800 German soldiers standing in rough formations, waiting. An American officer climbed onto a platform, a translator beside him. "The war in Europe is over," the officer said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich no longer exists. You will remain here as prisoners of war until repatriation arrangements can be made." That is all. The announcement hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the reactions came. Some prisoners collapsed to their knees. Some began to cry. Some stood frozen, unable to process the words. Dieter screamed, "Lies!" and had to be restrained by guards who held him gently, carefully, until he stopped struggling and simply sagged in their arms. Klaus stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his face blank. The war was over. Everything was over. His father had died for nothing. Ernst had been torn apart for nothing. Klaus had believed and fought and nearly starved for nothing. Germany had lost. The Nazis had lost. And Klaus was standing in America, healthy and whole, while his homeland burned. That night, the barracks erupted in arguments. Otto, back from the hospital but diminished and hollow-eyed, insisted they should have fought to the last man. "Every one of us," he said, his voice rising. "We should have died rather than surrender. We should have died with honor." Hans, ever pragmatic, responded quietly. "And what would that have accomplished? We'd be dead and Germany would still have lost." "At least we'd have honor," Otto shot back. "Honor," Klaus said, his voice cutting through the argument like a blade. Everyone turned to look at him. He rarely spoke in these debates. "Honor is what officers tell soldiers so they'll die willingly. I've learned something here. I'm lucky. Lucky to be captured by the Americans. Lucky to be fed and warm and alive. If feeling lucky makes me dishonorable, then I have no honor. But I'm alive." Silence fell. Then Franz spoke, his young voice uncertain. "Is it wrong to be glad we survived?" "Yes," Otto said immediately. "No," Hans said just as quickly. Klaus said nothing more. He climbed into his bunk and lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the others argue into the night. He didn't know what was right anymore. He only knew what was true. He was alive when he should be dead, and he owed that life to the mercy of men he had been taught to hate. In the following weeks, more news arrived. The full scope of the Holocaust became clear. 6 million Jews, millions of others. Systematized murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The American officers showed more films, more photographs, more evidence. They brought in survivors who told their stories through translators, their voices flat, their eyes distant, describing horrors that made the prisoners squirm in their seats. Klaus listened to every word. He forced himself to hear it all. This was what he had served. This was what Germany had done. He had not pulled a trigger in the camps. He had not operated an oven. But he had worn the uniform. He had believed the lies. He had fought for the system that built those camps. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight on his chest that never lifted. One evening in June, Klaus returned to the canteen. He had money saved, weeks of wages from his forestry work. He stood in front of the ice cream freezer and the Coca-Cola cooler, just as he had done that first time 8 months ago. But now the choice felt different. Now he knew everything. Now he carried the weight of understanding. He bought both. Ice cream cone and Coca-Cola bottle. He took them outside and sat on his bench. The same bench where he had cried that first time. He ate the ice cream slowly, tasting the sweetness and the cold. He drank the Coca-Cola, feeling the bubbles on his tongue. And this time, he didn't cry. He just sat there, holding symbols of American abundance, a German soldier who had lost everything and gained nothing except his life. An American guard walked past, the young corporal who sometimes supervised their work detail. He paused, seeing Klaus. "Evening," he said in English. Klaus had learned a little by now, enough to respond. "Good evening." The guard nodded, started to walk away, then turned back. "You doing okay?" he asked. Klaus looked at him, this young American who could have been his age, who probably had parents who worried about him, who might have a girl back home, who was just another person caught up in a war neither of them had started. "Yes," Klaus said. "Thank you." The guard nodded again and walked on. "Thank you." Klaus had thanked an enemy soldier. The words had come automatically, naturally, because the guard had shown concern, had asked if he was all right, had treated him like a human being. And that, Klaus realized, was what had broken him. Not cruelty, not torture, not starvation or abuse. Kindness. The Americans had destroyed everything Klaus believed by showing him kindness when he expected brutality. They had treated him like a person when his own leaders had treated him like a tool. And that kindness had forced him to confront the truth, that everything he had been taught was a lie. July brought the first repatriation notices. Lists were posted on the barracks walls, names of prisoners scheduled for return to Germany. Klaus's name appeared in August. He would ship out in September 1946, 2 years after his capture. 2 years of regular meals and safe beds and work that didn't kill him. 2 years of living better as a prisoner than he had as a free man in Germany. The night before departure, Hans found Klaus sitting outside the barracks looking at the stars. "Nervous?" Hans asked, sitting beside him. "Terrified," Klaus admitted. "I don't know what I'm going back to. My mother might be dead. My city is probably gone. Germany is occupied, divided, and I'm..." He gestured to himself, to his healthy body, his clean clothes. "I'm this. How do I explain this?" "You tell the truth," Hans said. "That you were captured, that you were treated fairly, that you survived. Whether they believe you or not isn't your responsibility. What if they call me a traitor? What if they say I should have died rather than accept enemy charity?" Hans was quiet for a long moment. Then they don't understand what we learned here. That mercy matters more than vengeance. That enemies can be decent. That survival isn't betrayal. You carry that knowledge, Klaus. That's what you bring back to Germany. Not shame, knowledge. The next morning, Klaus and 200 other prisoners boarded trucks for the journey to the coast. American guards accompanied them, the same guards who had watched them for 2 years. Some shook hands with prisoners they had come to know. Sergeant Morrison, the forestry supervisor, found Klaus before he boarded. "You were a good worker, Weber," he said through a translator. "I hope things go well for you." He extended his hand. Klaus shook it, this man who had been his captor and in some strange way his protector. The ship journey back across the Atlantic was subdued. The prisoners, healthy and well-fed after 2 years of American captivity, stood at the rails watching the coastline fade. They were going home. But home was a place that no longer existed. Germany was occupied, defeated, divided. What waited for them there was uncertain. The ship docked in Hamburg in October 1946. Klaus stepped onto German soil for the first time in over 2 years and felt nothing like relief. The city was devastated beyond recognition. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their windows empty, their walls crumbling. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and gray and exhausted. This was home. This was what remained. Klaus found his mother in a displaced persons camp, a converted school building housing refugees who had lost their homes to bombing. She was alive, barely. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, her clothes hanging loose on her skeletal frame. When she saw Klaus, she wept. They held each other, and Klaus felt her bones through her thin dress. She felt like she might break. "You're alive," she whispered. "You're healthy." There was something in her voice Klaus couldn't identify. Relief? Resentment? Both? "I was captured, Mama. The Americans captured me." She pulled back, looking at him with hollow eyes. "They fed you?" It wasn't a question. Klaus nodded. "Yes, they fed us. They treated us fairly." His mother's face twisted with something painful. "We starved," she said quietly. "While you were fed, we starved. Your aunt died. Your cousin died. Half the neighborhood died. And you?" She touched his face, his full cheeks. "You were fed." Klaus wanted to explain. Wanted to tell her about the guilt, about how every meal had felt like a betrayal, about how he had thought of her with every bite. But the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he had eaten turkey while she ate grass? That he had drunk Coca-Cola while she drank contaminated water? That he had stood in a canteen choosing between luxuries while she had nothing? "I'm sorry, Mama," was all he could manage. She held him again, her thin arms wrapped around him. "No," she said. "No, I'm glad. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you're healthy. I'm just..." Her voice broke. "I'm just so tired." Klaus stayed with his mother in the displaced persons camp. He found work in the reconstruction effort, clearing rubble, rebuilding walls, trying to resurrect a city from ashes. The work was hard and the pay was minimal, but it was work. Germany was starting over, from nothing, and Klaus was part of that beginning. But he never forgot Fort Lewis, never forgot the ice cream and the Coca-Cola, never forgot the American guards who had treated him with more dignity than his own officers ever had. Never forgot the lesson that mercy, even small mercy, has a power that cruelty can never match. Years passed, decades. Germany rebuilt, slowly transforming from ruins to prosperity. Klaus married, had children, built a life, but always in the back of his mind was that moment in the canteen. That choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola. That realization that everything he had believed was a lie, and that his enemies had saved him by showing him the truth. In 2016, at age 91, Klaus Weber wrote a letter to the United States Army. His hands shook as he wrote, his penmanship uncertain, but the words were clear. "It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp at Fort Lewis considering what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army, and not the Russian one. But what I really learned in that moment was something deeper. I learned that I had been lied to about everything. That my enemies were more merciful than my leaders. That kindness can come from the most unexpected places. That survival is not betrayal. The Americans didn't have to treat us well. We were the enemy. We had fought for something monstrous. But they chose mercy over revenge. They chose to see us as human beings, not as symbols. And that choice changed my life. I am 91 years old now. I have lived a long, full life. I raised children and grandchildren in a free, democratic Germany. And every time I eat ice cream, which is often, I remember that moment. I remember standing in that canteen, holding 2 coins, choosing between 2 simple pleasures, and realizing that mercy is stronger than hatred. Thank you for my life. Thank you for teaching me what my own country never could. That enemies are just people on the other side, and that treating them with dignity is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. I chose the ice cream, by the way. It was vanilla, and it was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. Klaus Weber died 6 months after writing that letter, surrounded by family in a comfortable apartment in Stuttgart. His children found the letter among his possessions, carefully preserved along with an old German iron cross and a single American dime he had kept for 70 years. They donated both to a museum, the medal that represented what he had fought for, and the coin that represented what had saved him. 2 pieces of metal, 2 opposing forces, 2 different paths. Klaus had walked both, and in the end he chose to remember not the war he lost, but the mercy he received. Because that's what mattered. Not the battles or the defeats or the grand ideologies, but the small moments of human kindness. The ice cream cone, the Coca-Cola, the guard who asked if he was okay. The mercy that should not have existed but did. That's the story Klaus wanted remembered, not as propaganda, not as politics, just as truth. Simple, complicated, painful truth. That even in the darkest times, even when humanity seems impossible, there are those who choose mercy, who offer ice cream to the enemy, who prove that we are all, at the end, just people trying to survive in a world that keeps trying to make us into monsters. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we meet someone who reminds us we don't have to be.